Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of our Election Science Office Hours, which is a webinar and podcast hosted by the Lynn Center for Science, Society, and Policy here at Caltech and moderated by me, Michael Alvarez. You can now find our archive, which has 17 of these episodes, which is kind of cool, available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and on our Caltech Election Integrity Project website at protectingtheelection.us. Make sure you can also follow us on socials. We're on LinkedIn, X, Blue Sky in particular for the latest updates on the work that we're doing with our project and also with these podcasts. Today, our guest is Maggie Toulouse OIiver, the New Mexico Secretary of State. Madam Secretary, welcome to the Election Science Office Hours. Thanks for being here with us today.
I'm happy to be here with you guys. Thank you.
Thanks. And this is fun because we'd actually tried to do this back in election season,
We
but
did.
we got super busy then, and I got called by LA County, our good friends there, to serve as in jury duty. So
Oh gosh.
we
Yeah.
at that point, but it's super exciting. So Maggie is New Mexico's 26th Secretary of State, and has also previously served the people of New Mexico for quite some time with elections. She's been Secretary of State since 2016, but was first appointed to public office in 2007, which is about the time I think we got to know each other, when she became county clerk in New Mexico's largest county, Bernalillo County, which for those of you who don't know New Mexico is Albuquerque and the suburbs of Albuquerque, essentially. She was first.
Quick point on that. You and I actually first met when I was in my first round as a grad student at UNM, when you and Lana Atkinson, who was my mentor professor at the time, were working together on stuff. So we go back that far.
Yeah. It's really interesting that I never really step back and think like how long folks I've known each. I mean, I've been working on elections since 2000, and it's like it seems like it's been forever. And you've been working in this area about as long, so it kind of seems like forever. So let's see. So overseeing elections in the state's largest county gave you a really super detailed on-the-ground experience in election administration that I think has been fundamental in the work that you've been doing when in helping New Mexico voters statewide. And we'll talk about some of that today, hopefully. In addition to your elected position, you're the immediate past president of the National Association of Secretaries of State, which we call NAS. And you have served in NAS as president, president-elect, treasurer, and chair of the most important committee, which is the Elections Committee. And as you mentioned, your bachelor's and master's are in political science, yay. And I think that you're currently still working towards your PhD at UNM. And we may want to talk about that later because I'm curious to hear more.
I'm in dissertation stage finally.
Congratulations, Liz. We call it.
Thank you.
Oh, you've had a long career in election administration in New Mexico. What originally got you excited about working in elections generally, but also elections in New Mexico?
Well, I always, when I get asked this question, I didn't grow up dreaming about like being a county clerk or a secretary of state, being an election administrator per se, but I was always interested in politics, and I knew I wanted to be active in politics. And right after high school, I worked on my first political campaign, which was a re-election for our then U.S. Senator Jeff Bingaman, who was the longstanding chair of the Committee on Energy. Of course, here in New Mexico, we have Los Alamos and Sandia National Labs. So really important committee for someone from New Mexico to be the chair of. And I had the opportunity to work on his reelection campaign. And then I basically started working my way through college and grad school on political campaigns. And as a sort of junior staffer, spent most of my time knocking on people's doors, talking to them about the upcoming election, how to vote, where to vote, how to get registering people to vote, recruiting volunteers, training them to go talk to people, and then working my way up kind of within the ranks of the Democratic Party as well, getting very active, making a lot of connections and friends within the party. I mean, pretty much all I did was hang out with sort of political nerds that worked on campaigns and were involved in the party. So I did that for about 13 years and worked my way through grad school. And then I had just come off the 2006 election cycle, working for the League of Conservation Voters, running their office there. And our then county clerk was elected Secretary of State, creating a vacancy for 2 years left in her term. And my husband at the time actually said, "Well, you should go for that." And actually several people did. They were like, "There's no one more qualified. There's no one that knows more about the voter side." And the registration, what people need from the clerk's office, and how, frankly, and you probably remember this, Mike, it was kind of a mess
Right.
back then. In fact, I like to tell people, for those who remember or who have heard stories of the 2000 presidential election, Al Gore only won New Mexico by 365 votes.
Mhm.
So had it not been for Florida,
Right.
we would have been Florida, because we had almost as big a mess and a really ugly recount, and it was very, very close.
Mhm.
So, long story short, I thought there's a lot of opportunity to really improve the way elections run and to make it more voter centric, quite frankly. And
Mhm.
so I threw my hat in the ring, and the rest is history.
So you're now Secretary of State, though, and there's always this confusion I think that people have about exactly what secretaries of states do, because it varies quite a bit by state.
Yes.
So what exactly is your job as Secretary of State, and kind of what does it entail kind of on a day-to-day basis?
I would say we have three main functions in my office and a lot of additional sort of, I call us the office where when the legislature wants something done, but they don't know where to put it, they put it with us.
Mhm.
But the three main functions are, of course, elections. That's the number one. We oversee them statewide. We write all the rules and procedures. We make sure the county clerks have the money and the tools they need. And we are charged with making sure they're done uniformly, and in a non-discriminatory fashion. And so that involves a lot of working directly with the county clerks around the state. The second piece is the ethics piece. So we are responsible for making sure lobbyists and candidates and campaigns and political committees of all kinds report all of the money they raise and spend. That if they're not doing that timely, that we are trying to bring them into what we call voluntary compliance. And if
Mhm.
they're intentionally breaking the law or build up enough fines, we send them and work together with the State Ethics Commission, that has a much broader function regarding ethics. And then the third piece is the business services component. Every single business in the state, whether it's a profit or a nonprofit, whether it's what we call a domestic entity, in other words, a business created in New Mexico, or it's a foreign entity, in other words, a business wanting to do business in New Mexico from another state, they have to file with our office. They have to file annual reports. If they're changing anything about the structure of their business, they have to update with us and pay annual fees and things like that. So that's a huge component of our office that often goes, it's not the sexy part, right? It doesn't really get in the news. And but half of my staff are in the
Mhm.
business services division. Um, so other offices, other secretaries of state do things like run the motor vehicle division, run the state's libraries, museums, We have a role on the Records and Archives Commission, and they joke and tell me I'm their boss, but I'm one of like several bosses, right? Because there's a commission. But those are the three main functions, and we don't. Oh, some secretaries of state oversee like securities and
Right.
actually perform international relations and things like that. But that's not, that's an occasional function of my office, but not, an actual statutory function.
Right. So you're a statewide elected official,
Correct.
and your term is about to expire, your second term, and your term limited,
It's
right?
actually my second full term
Second
because
full-
I had a partial term,
Right.
just like I did for county clerk.
Okay. And so actually one of the things we'll talk a little bit about is just kind of
Yeah.
look back, right, on how things have what you've accomplished. And one of the things that it's an interesting connection that I've never made about your career, which is how you started off really in the elections world, the partisan elections world. And
Right.
one of the things that I don't think people realize about New Mexico and what makes it a really unique place politically is just how retail politics, that on the ground grassroots stuff is still so important. I was just in San
Vital.
yeah, last week, and on the 4th of July, there was a guy walking around who's running for city council in Santa Fe. And that kind of politics is still critical, critical.
The pancake breakfast on the plaza on 4th of
Yeah,
July. It's like you got to go to it if
yeah.
if you're running for office. Yeah,
That's what is
exactly.
kind of fun about going to New Mexico in political season, and I'm sure it makes your life fun.
Well, it's kind of like Iowa in that sense too,
Yeah.
right? You got to go to the Iowa State Fair. You have to go to every little town and every little restaurant and whatnot. And as you know, Mike, because you spent a lot of time in New Mexico, it's a huge state.
Mhm.
It's actually, with the exception of Albuquerque, it's very rural. I mean, Santa Fe, where I live, is the third largest city, and it's about 90,000 people. And if you don't go in person, to your point, people take it personally.
Mhm.
They actually take it personally if you don't show up in person to meet them. So,
Well, and again, it's like the retail politics is important, but that's also where a lot of the administrative work happens, like registering voters, right? And telling people, about their rights to vote and how to vote by mail and all of those important things. And you've done a lot, I think, of innovative things since you've been Secretary of State, in particular, from my perspective, as an outsider watching what you're doing in the area of voter registration modernization and also election security. Um,
right.
what do you think your major accomplishments have been as Secretary of State in New Mexico?
Well, the way I like to describe it is over the last 20 years or so, I've been running elections, whether at the county or the state level, for 18 and a half years now. So whether I was, doing this work as county clerk, where we started to kind of move in the direction of modernization. So, for example, we started with creating the option for vote centers.
Mhm.
And right away in Bernalillo County, we moved away from a precinct-based model to a vote center-based model.
Mhm.
And we moved to ballot on demand systems instead of our first vote center election. We literally shredded 2 million ballots in the primary that we didn't end up needing because we wanted to make sure we had enough ballots, because we had to have ballots for every single precinct at every single polling place. Because once we created vote centers, that meant you could vote anywhere, right? And so then moving to ballot on demand was very necessary very quickly. In other words, you show up, you give your information, and we're able to print a ballot, quote, on demand, rather than pre-printing and wasting a bunch of paper and killing a bunch of trees. And then over the years, since right before I became Secretary of State, but I lobbied really hard as county clerk for online voter registration. Once that came up and running, we were then also quickly able to move to online absentee application. So different states call it something different, whether it's vote by mail or absentee ballot. the technical term in New Mexico is still absentee ballot, but just think of it as voting by mail.
Mhm.
And then we moved to automated voter registration at the we call it MVD here. I think we're the only state that does, instead of DMV or something like that, motor vehicle division, where you were offered the opportunity automatically, but you could say no. And then we literally just passed a new law that went into effect 9 days ago, that now everybody that we know is a citizen for sure, because they've provided an American passport or birth certificate or some, other document that, if you're a native, tribal member, your tribal ID, something like that, then you're automatically registered to vote, period, end of story, and you can opt out after the fact. So we've done a lot on that front, and it's taken, it's been very incremental. So
Mhm.
as we've done a new way of doing things, we've implemented, we've fixed kinks. When we first did the when we took the human factor out of voter registration at motor vehicle division, we were having problems with people making sure they chose a party if they wanted to choose a party. So we had to fix that piece and make sure people knew, look, if you want it, we at the time had closed primary elections. So if you want to vote in the primary, you have to pick a party, those kinds of things. So we kept learning little by little by little and adjusting. And I think that was a smart way of doing it, because we weren't trying to do everything all at once. And then inevitably, that could have been a mess, and we learned a lot along the way. So whenever we did implement something new, or as we've implemented new things, we've been able to be really smart and thoughtful about it and learn from, challenges we've had in past implementations.
So do you think that is one of the keys to success, has been the sort of cautious incremental steps that you take? Because, looking back as I was preparing for this, I was thinking about what New Mexico was like, electorally back in 2000, 2004,
It
2000.
was awful.
And I'm really amazed at the progress that's been made, uh,
Yeah,
improving, not just the registration part, but election auditing, election security.
right.
So is this really one of the sort of, keys to how successful you've been modernizing the voter registration system in New Mexico, is moving slowly?
I think so. And I think COVID was interesting. I mean, there's you and I could have an hours long conversation about the 2020 election, and how different and scary and landscape changing that was. But I think that did force a lot of states to do things really quickly, without being able to do things incrementally. So for example, like New Jersey went straight to being a vote by mail state, without having kind of slowly implemented it. And frankly, it worked out well for them.
Hmm.
But I think that is the exception, not the rule, when you try to do things on the fly. And of course, we had to do a lot of other things on the fly, in terms of keeping people safe, and making sure people voted in person safely. But we also had to really ramp up our vote by mail operation, because people just did not want to leave their houses and chance getting sick by going to a polling place. So yeah, the short story long is that I do think the incremental implementation has made us very successful. And in fact, I'm sure you were planning to point this out, but we're rated number one, at least as of 2022, on the MIT Election Lab Index of Election Administration.
Hmm.
And maybe we'll stay number one, or maybe we'll drop down somewhere else in the top 10. But the bottom line is, we've gone from being very low on the list of good election administrators to being very high on the list
Mhm.
of good election administrators, because I think again of that thoughtful
Mhm.
and here's the last thing I'll say about that. You have to get legislators on board,
Right.
and sometimes it takes them a long time.
Mhm.
We finally just got a bill passed this year to allow independents to
Mhm.
vote in primary elections.
Mhm.
And the legislators were totally against that for years and years, because that means now they have to not only campaign to people within their party, but they have to campaign to the independents too in a
Mhm.
primary, right? So that's going to cost them more money. It creates an unknown factor for them. Um, so we have legislators to convince, and as I was once a county clerk, we have county clerks to get on board, because it's great if I have an idea. And of course, that means work, whatever we end up doing means work for my office, but it
Mhm.
means work for the county clerks too, right?
Mhm.
And how is it going to affect them? And how are they going to be able to stay on top of, or is it going to create, for example, this new automatic voter registration that's just passed? We got on the very first day, we got 1,500 registrations, updates, newer updates
Mhm.
from Motor Vehicle Division, and that's approximately 4 times as many as we normally get in a day. So now we know county clerks are going to have a lot of mail to process, right? That they didn't used to have to. Um, so again, that was a very long way of answering your your short question.
No, there's a lot of interesting things there too. Like, you know, I know one of the things that is unique or relatively unique about New Mexico, in particular, coming from California, where I'm based, is that, our legislature, meets all the time. The New Mexico legislature is only in session for a very, very brief period of time. So that must make, when you want something to happen, that's got to make, your life kind of complicated because you have a very brief period of time to convince them to, enact new legislation.
Yes. So, for you all that are California based or from somewhere else, you'll find this very humorous. So, when our Constitution was written in 1912, it was really written around a rural sort of agriculture based concept of, when are all these guys, of course they were all guys at the time, going to be able to come up to Santa Fe, to the capital, to meet and get the work of the state done. And so they decided it was going to be in the middle of the winter. It was going to start in the middle of the winter when crops aren't growing, right? And it was going to be for either 60 days in, let's see, odd numbered years, or 30 days in even numbered years. And the 60-day session was going to tackle every type of issue, and
Hmm.
the 30-day session was only going to be for the budget
Hmm.
and or things that the governor wants to put. And so it ends up being just a compressed
Hmm.
version of the 60-day session, and our legislators are not paid.
Hmm.
They are the last unpaid. They get a per diem, right? They get money for their expenses.
Hmm.
But it's actually, like, frankly, it won't even really cover a hotel night in Santa Fe.
Hmm.
Uh, so yeah, we have a very old fashioned, and there's been, I have been somewhat involved in that. I'm supportive, but there's been a huge effort to modernize our legislature as
Hmm.
well, for the exact reason you're talking about. And to your point, yeah, we have to be quick. We have to be working with these legislators year round, talking to them. We try not to just drop bills on them at the beginning of the session that they've never seen or heard of or thought of before, because they're like, wait, what is this 300-page bill that's going to do all this thing to elections? I don't have the time to read this. I don't have the time to even, read all the bills I'm sponsoring, right? So it is very challenging to get legislation passed in the New Mexico legislative environment.
So you've already mentioned this, that New Mexico is a huge state. I mean, it's a big state geographically. Uh,
Yeah, fifth largest in the country. Yeah.
And I think a lot of people don't realize. They also don't realize how diverse the state is, socioeconomically, ethnically. It's just an incredibly diverse state.
Yes.
And one of the things that is, I think, really striking about New Mexico is the large and diverse population of Native Americans in the state.
Yes.
And many of them live in very rural places.
Yes.
Many of them use only their native language. I know this has been a point of emphasis for you, is really trying to help enfranchise those communities.
Right.
Can you talk a bit about the challenges that they face when they're trying to
Sure.
participate in your elections and what you've been doing to improve accessibility for the Native American communities in New Mexico?
Sure. So, first of all, there are 32 federally recognized tribal entities in New Mexico, and of course, the piece of the Navajo Nation that's in New Mexico is the largest piece. The bigger half is in Arizona, and then there's a teeny tiny part in southern Utah. There's one chapter, and their sort of political subdivisions are what they call agencies and chapters underneath that. And then we have a number of Pueblo tribes that all, frankly, they're spread out geographically and they don't all speak the same language. Some of them speak similar languages, and some of them don't. And then we have three Apache reservations.
Mhm.
So we're talking about different tribes, different cultures, different languages, and we are required, of course, to provide voter information and ballot, voting assistance in all of those languages. And so what we tend to do is hire poll workers in those areas that already speak those languages. Um, because even though most of them can and do speak a fair amount of English,
Mhm.
it's you're always more comfortable in your native language. And the dialects are different too, even among, so for example, Towa, Tiwa, and Kiris are the three prime Pueblo languages. There are even dialectical differences. One of the big things that I've learned in working with the tribes is that not all of them have a culture of voting. So in the late 1950s, Miguel Trujillo from Isleta Pueblo actually won the right in court for natives to vote. He had served in World War II. He was an Isleta Pueblo native, and he went to the county clerk's office and tried to register to vote. And we had this old thing in our constitution that said Indians not taxed can't vote. And anyway, he got the right to vote. But Isleta, for example, Isleta Pueblo, has a culture of voting for their local leadership. Other tribes, so does the Navajo Nation. So do some of the other Pueblo and Apache tribes. But some of them, Taos Pueblo is perhaps, the oldest. I mean, it's a World Heritage Site. They are an elder-based decision-making community. So they elect their leadership from among their elders who are primarily men,
Mhm.
and the rest of the, tribal folks don't get to vote. So how do you get folks from a very rural place um, that doesn't have a culture of voting, that has a challenging language that we need to make sure we have folks who speak and can interpret, and make sure that we have a polling location or opportunities in a very rural place, right? The Navajo Nation, for example, it spans a huge part of New Mexico, and the chapters are spread way out. They
Mhm.
can be 50 or 60 miles apart from each other. So with that picture in mind, we created a native voting task force
Mhm.
involving folks from all of the different kinds of tribes, both to establish them kind of as liaisons, but and we already had folks working on staff kind of with the mechanics of native voting, but as sort of liaisons to the tribes, but also to give us advice about how we can do a better job with the access piece,
Mhm.
because that's, if you were living in the middle of the Navajo Nation, we still have people who are living in literal hogans with no running water and no electricity. So, they have to know someone or have a car and know where to go to vote. And, there's a lot of information they don't have access to, right? That we have to fill that gap. And it's a huge challenge.
And for many of those voters, they also don't have like ready mail service. I mean, because I
Yeah.
think a lot of folks, when I've heard people talk about New Mexico, they'll say, well, why not just, move towards voting by mail? But it's not like they have, postal service trucks driving down the street and dropping mail for these folks either, because many of them have to go many miles, right, to just access their mail, right?
So in fact, it's kind of cute. In New Mexico, to register to vote, you either have to write down your home address, so 123 Main Street, or you can provide a written description. I live down the road. Just if you turn right off of Highway 98 and you go about a mile and a half and you see a big cottonwood tree and there's a driveway about 20 yards after that, that's where I live.
Hmm.
Or you can draw that on a map, or you can provide points of geolocation, right? So then the mail service has the same challenge. A lot of folks could just get PO boxes somewhere, but we passed actually a big voting rights bill 2 years ago, and within the Voting Rights Act in New Mexico, we also enshrined the Native American Voting Rights Act, which we thought was the first in the nation. Actually came to find out we were the second behind Washington State, but we're still pretty proud of that. So for example, now we can use tribal government buildings as a place where voters can both receive and send their ballots back. Tribes can just request a drop box for those, and we'll put one there, no questions asked. And we've also made it easier for them to set their early voting hours, because tribal government, except for the Navajo Nation, changes annually, the leadership. So, they have to know when they're coming in January, they need enough time to be able to say, okay, this is where we want our polling places, this is where we want our early voting, and all of that. So we had to make sure that happened too. So there's just, again, we could go on and on about the cultural idiosyncrasies of working with tribes and Native folks, but I started working with tribes when I was 19, and now I am 30 years plus that. So I have that benefit, but that's honestly the only way we've been able to do what we've been able to do, and there's still way more to do.
Hmm.
So that's the challenge.
Yeah, it's a big challenge, and I think you've done some amazing things to try to really help enfranchise those communities, but also to listen to them with your task force, which I think is a good model for other states to consider following. Now, another thing that I know you've put a lot of time and effort into, both in New Mexico but also at NAS, has been election security and cybersecurity. Can you talk about like the things that you are most concerned about in terms of those types of threats as we look, ahead to the next cycle in 2026, but also more importantly to what's probably going to be also another really contested presidential election in 2028?
Yeah, so to just give some brief context, I think we were all sort of concerned about cybersecurity, but not as like a full unit of states, uh, local and local entities, right? It was all sort of siloed. And then, after 2016, I hear a lot of people say the election was rigged for Trump. And if you mean rigged in the sense that vote numbers were changed, no, that never happened. What did happen was Russia was able to poke around in some systems and look at some data and kind of, it was almost like they were just looking around to see what they could get into and what they could find. But so we're aware of breaches, but what they were mainly doing was pushing out a lot of mis and disinformation, right? And really trying to rile up the American community through social media, and get them, they frankly, the Russians really don't care
Mhm.
if it's Trump or Hillary or Trump or Biden or Trump or whoever's going to run in, not Trump,
Mhm.
constitutionally he cannot, whoever runs in 2028. What they want is for America's democracy to be weakened, so that they can gain more power in the world, period, end of story. So we've had to be very concerned about since then, coming together, using our collective resources, at the federal, state, and local levels, to increase our security posture, to make sure that we are out there looking for weird activity, preventing denial of service attacks, which is sort of one of their favorite ways. Let's say it's the last day to register to vote, and you do a denial of service attack against our online registration system. Well, that's a great way to make it harder for people to vote, right? Or messing with our election night results sites. I think we've been doing this excellent job, and frankly, the Department of Homeland Security at the federal level and CISA, the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency underneath that, have been amazing partners with us for the last 8 years. And now, unfortunately, under the new administration, which is ironic because under the previous administration, it was amazing when Trump was president the first time. And in fact, I went as a Democrat and testified before Congress how fantastic it was to work with them. But now they've cut funding, they've cut staff, they're taking the focus off of providing the federal assistance. And so states and local governments are having to take, frankly, these huge roles on ourselves. And it's very difficult for us as individual states to combat nation states like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. They're the foremost active, in trying to interfere with any kind of government systems or any kind of secure infrastructure in the US. And we're all kind of trying to figure out, how do we do that in this new environment? Where do we find funding? How can we use collective resources to keep, the level of protection that we've had? And it's a big challenge.
I've recently been hearing people essentially say, why are we really concerned about this? We don't see any evidence that there's threats to elections. We don't, see that these elections are being attacked. And, my reaction to that is always, well, that's because of all the hard work that's going in.
I can tell you for a fact, we're literally, we've built a huge shield. We have things like Albert sensors, which are designed to detect unusual activity and
Mhm.
give us, sort of tip us off in advance if we're going to see something weird happen. We have all sorts of backups, in case, let's say we do get denial of service attacked, that we're able to fall back on backup systems. One thing that's really important is we've had a system, of which the future is uncertain, where we've shared information. So if something happens in, usually we don't know where, but that it happened in a state where they got ransomware, let's say, in a county election office. Um, we get given that information, and we get given the IP address or the specific email language or whatever, and we know to look out for it,
Mhm.
so that it doesn't happen. So to your point, Mike, that is why people don't think elections are at risk, because we've taken our cybersecurity so seriously for the last 8 years.
Right. And these again, I think these are threats that are ongoing and they're real.
Yes.
And
Yes.
like I believe Taos County just had a cyber attack. And so
They've been malwared, yeah, and we're trying to figure out how to keep their, we literally have emergency kits to
Mhm,
keep their county clerk's office functions going. They have a special election coming up in August,
mhm,
so they need to be able, totally separate from their system, which has been malwared. They need to be able to continue their daily functions, and so we've had to create a system that allows them to do that.
mhm. And so related to this, I mean, you already mentioned mis and disinformation. I know that in 2024, you were out in the forefront, in that fight against those kind of attacks, ranging from, providing all sorts of useful, like what I would call kind of debunking of rumor information on your website. You had billboards, you had a public information campaign, which I thought was really clever. Um, what tactics in 2024 do you think that you used that were really effective in the fight against misinformation in New Mexico?
Well, I think we learned the lessons from 16, and I think we applied them fairly effectively in 2020. But
Mhm,
then once we saw the rise of the election, what we call the election denial movement, the Stop the Steal folks, the big lie folks, we went, whoa, we have to really ramp up our efforts in 2024. So besides using every cent that we had available to us to make sure folks had correct information, and we run our rumor versus reality site, so whenever some Mr. Disinfo gets spread around the internet, we correct it for the record on our website, and we go on TV and radio, and we go on all of our social media pages and do that. But we also have learned to pre-bunk,
mhm,
and so working very closely with media, doing sort of regular social updates and posts about,
mhm,
did you know that there are literally, and I'll ask your students and colleagues here, there are literally 3 levels of audits before the election is even certified, and then a post-election audit. So we have the county level, we have the state level, we have an independent auditor that
mhm,
then makes sure what we've done at the state level is correct. We certify the election, and then we do a random post-election audit, risk-based audit, where the auditor comes in, literally rolls I forget how many sides of die it is. One, those
Excited.
Dungeons and Dragons
Second.
die,
Yeah.
and so many, and color, black represents a certain in column, and green is another, and we pick the precincts that way, and we do it on video, and then we hand tally and compare that to the machine tally, right? So letting folks know, like, there, and yes, you can be there.
Mhm,
You can be there when the machines are tested on the front end. You can watch the canvas,
mhm.
and you can watch the audit, right? This is all public, transparent process. So I think we keep doing a better and better job of that. And Mike, as you know, I've continued to work closely with Professor Lana Atkinson, who you and I have both worked with over the years, who used to be at the University of New Mexico and now is at Florida State. And I've worked with her since 2008
Mhm.
to do a study either at the county level or the state level of all sorts of things about how we've run the elections, looking at election administration and what we can improve. But she's noted that over time, confidence in election administration has steadily increased
Mhm.
in that, gosh, almost 20-year period.
Mhm.
And I think it's because we've gotten not only better at doing the things like you mentioned earlier, audits, right? We've gotten better at doing those, but we've also gotten better at making sure people know we do those and that they're able to um, be a part of that and watch that if they care to, because it's basically like watching paint dry. But a lot of people like to do that, so that's great.
So as someone who cares a lot about elections in general, but elections obviously in New Mexico, is there what keeps you up at night about the next couple of cycles? Not politically, but in terms of like threats to elections.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, maybe you don't want to talk about that because you don't want to give anybody any tips, but
Yeah, yeah.
but in
um,
general, I mean, is it on the misinformation side? Is it on the cyber side? Is it just more, do you worry more about just general gaffes and, just the usual
yeah.
human problems that arise in elections?
Well, here's what I've learned. So, just to give some context, 18 and a half years of running elections, I have either run or overseen 5 presidential elections
Mhm.
during that time. Um, so I don't even know how many midterms I've run. I guess this will be my fifth midterm
Mhm.
in 2026. And then not to mention the primaries, the specials,
Right.
everything in between. What I have learned is that every election is different and it has its own flavor. And we always crack each other up. And first of all, we have a very serious but also irreverent sort of office culture, because it's like if you're not laughing you're crying. So sometimes we have to just go like, can you believe people like, can you believe that they found this random thing to start to pick at? It's like every election there's like a random thing people start getting really focused on that's happened every single election.
Mhm.
But this year, right, for some reason, they're like, well, something's got to be done about this, or they get real focused on it. So that's one thing. Like we never know what the thing is going to be
Mhm.
because it's different every time. And then we don't know whether the thing is going to be a big thing or a small thing, or how many things there are going to be that people get focused on. So it's hard to stay up at night worrying about one thing in particular. I will tell you the thing that I am most concerned about right now is the federal government, is DHS in general,
Mhm.
which had previously been a fantastic agency
Mhm.
to work with, that has become, I think, as we all watch the news, very different. It's got a very different focus. No matter your political beliefs, I definitely have strongly, I'll be honest with this group, strongly negative political beliefs about the direction that it's turned. But importantly for elections, the fact that it has gotten rid of its regional advisors,
Mhm.
is no longer paying for the information sharing. Um, uh, so when you get designated as critical infrastructure, which elections were in late 2006, there is a group that sort of creates an information sharing, um, I guess, infrastructure, and federal government's no longer paying for that for elections in specific. So states are having to take that cost on if we want to continue receiving that information. So being behind the 8 ball in
Mhm.
terms of the security of our systems, because the federal government is checking out of that and has completely changed its focus to something else, is really probably the most concerning issue that I have.
Yeah, that's a big one. I've heard that from quite a few other folks. Is just the
Yeah.
loss of the effective partnership that had been put together between states and counties and election officials and DHS and CISA, and various others. There is a gaping hole there, and I know that many are trying to figure out exactly how to fill that in.
Yeah.
So, we're getting towards the end of, I promised you it wouldn't be like more than an hour. And I got a million other questions, but the one that I think at this point I'm really curious about is like, you reflect back on your two and I guess 2+ terms, right? As secretary,
Oh, yeah, yeah. I got a spare partial term.
partial plus, but are there changes or reforms or initiatives that you wish you might have tackled and you just didn't have the opportunity to or the resources to?
I feel very fortunate that we've gotten, I mean, there are little things.
Mhm.
For example, this year we wanted to create some mandatory county clerk training. Right now, with the exception of right before an election, training is voluntary, and one of the challenges of voluntary training is it's usually the folks that need it the most that don't come to voluntary training, right? So there's little things around the edges. In terms of major policy implementation, I am leaving, especially with this, most recent passage of opening up our primaries, which has been a priority for me for a long time. I feel like I'm leaving the office having accomplished everything that I personally wanted to accomplish. There are some other things. A lot of people are interested in having a 100% vote by mail election system like they do in Washington, Oregon, California, Utah, and Colorado and New Jersey. And for me, what I am aware of is that, the former Secretary of State of Washington used to tell me, you need to create a permanent list of people who always get their votes through the mail, and once you hit 50%, you're ready as a state. We just created that opportunity to have a permanent list. Let's see, last session, or so this last election was the first time to sign up to be a permanent vote by mail voter. So we're not at 50% yet. So we're not ready as a state to get there. And if we do, I have a lot of thoughts about how to do that. I think Colorado's model probably makes the most sense for New Mexico. But to make a long story short, what I like to say is I've done everything that was really important to me and that I wanted to do, and vote by mail is going to be the next Secretary of State. There are other initiatives that the next Secretary of State can tackle, and I will be cheering them on.
So, two things about the next stage in your life. One is you're going to finish that PhD.
I am.
And what is your PhD going to be
I
about?
think I can. Well, as you know, I've done a ton of work on election auditing. Lana and I and one of our former colleagues, Thad Hall,
Mhm.
literally wrote the first book on election auditing, and the pilot that we did in New Mexico, which sort of created the we have a you hear the term risk limited audits.
Mhm.
We essentially have a risk limit. It's just sort of um it's set forth in statute, and it's literally written out. If the margin is X, then the number is Y. And so it's not a changing limit like, say, in Colorado, where the Secretary of State gets to set the risk limit, right? So in kind of doing all that pioneering work and having done so many audits over the years and having sort of tweaked it around the edges, and then having seen, you know the demand for audits in 2000 or in 2020, and we're going, we have an audit.
Mhm.
We've done an audit. No, we don't want your audit. We want an independent audit. This has been done by an independent, accountant and auditor. So what I'm really curious about is, most states now do have some sort of post-election audit, and it's taken a long time. And I'm interested in looking at whether it really has increased confidence or not, and what types of audits, or whether it's the way that they make it more open or less open, or whether it's I have a personal belief that that risk limiting that isn't set out in statute the way ours is in New Mexico, or even like the single ballot kind of audits, are so calculus heavy that a lay person, I mean, theoretically they're transparent, but is a layperson going to be able to understand how you got there? And are they going to have trust in that kind of a model? So I want to look at all of those things and really see, as of the date that I type the last period on, as of the date that I write the end on the dissertation, where people are feeling the most confident, what models seem to be the most successful, and hopefully that kind of moves or can provide some guidance for states that really do want to lead the way in terms of doing election auditing the best they possibly can.
That'll be a great dissertation, and I think
It will be boring as heck to the layperson.
well, but that's okay for a dissertation, right? But it will be, it'll be a great dissertation in the sense that it'll be a big contribution to the field, right? Because there is a lot that we don't know.
Right. Well, and you and I and Lana and our friend Jennifer wrote a white paper on that.
Right. Exactly.
What,
All
the
the
year
things we
before
don't
last?
know, right? So, and I'll go public and I'll volunteer to be a member of your committee.
Oh God, that would be amazing.
Feel free to take me up on that.
Okay. Be careful what you wish for.
No, it's fun. It'll be fun. Because I think it's a great subject, and like I said, I think it's one of these topics that we just really need to know more about, and I think that's a great dissertation.
That'll be my dissertation. I think in terms of research after the fact, though, there's a huge gap in terms of what we know about native voting.
Yes, I agree with that too.
Huge gap.
Yeah,
And that is something I'm interested in working on as well.
I agree. That's something that, I've learned a bit about over the years, and just think there's an enormous amount of work because there's just as you pointed out, every tribe does it differently, and they have different
Yeah.
cultures, and they have all sorts of different mechanisms that just haven't been explored in the literature. And I think there's a lot of things that we can learn, right, from these experiences that they've had and the kind of mechanisms and procedures that they use to.
Well, yeah, we try to do things in a white way,
Mhm.
like poll voters, native voters, whether they live in an urban environment or a tribal environment, and we try to ask them questions in this way that's sort of been sort of the mode of
Right.
development of white European data scientists, and we don't even know if the way we're asking the questions is being interpreted the way that we intend it, right? And so whether even if we're able to do the polling of native voters, whether we're even getting the right answers by using that sort of mode of data collection, right? So I think I think that is a wide open field of study, and again, having worked with tribes for 30 years, that I'm personally fascinated by. And I would never presume as a non-native person to be like, I'm the expert on native voting, but I do think there's work that can be done, and particularly that can assist those of us who are doing research on voting behavior, and look, the native pieces, again, sort of this nebulous piece. I think it can help those of us who are not native do better work.
No, I agree. So you've got dissertation, and then it sounds like major research project, book project lined up. It sounds like you're setting yourself up for an academic career. Um,
Yes.
okay. So is that what's next?
Hopefully. Yep. I
Okay.
mean, obviously there's that whole dissertation in the way. And got to get that done, but yeah, I'm planning to come primarily back to academia, and you know I'm planning to stay in the election world, doing some consulting, and continuing to work with election entities, whether they be local to New Mexico. Obviously I've built a huge network around the country, with election officials over the years. And obviously there's a lot of national organizations that do work around, improving election administration. So there's a lot of opportunities there as well. But unless the opportunity to run for the US Senate somehow comes around, people ask me why I'm not running for governor, and I'm like, do you know how horrible that job is? Have you seen what our governors had to go through during COVID and how, you know, unhappy they are? I think 20 years in political office is a good long time.
Quite a bit of experience there. So,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
that's going to be exciting. And, I really do hope that you take that career path, because I think you've got a lot of expertise and a lot of wonderful ideas and great connections. And
Thank you. Yeah.
we who are kind of in this nebulous world of election science can learn a lot from your experience and these ideas. It's going to be really exciting. So we look forward to having you part of the team.
Well, I'm excited to, I've always had my foot, I've never taken my toes totally out of the academic waters, but to be fully back in again is, I think, going to be great. So,
So I've had you for an hour. Thank you.
oh yeah, I have a leadership meeting I have to
Gotta
get
go.
on
But
now.
real quick, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you want to mention?
There's always more, but I just, I wanted to leave you all with knowing that I think looking at opportunities to work with your local election administrators, kind of like the work that I've done. If you go look up Professor Atkinson and you look at the New Mexico election survey work we've done over the last several years, getting with your chief election official, or even a local county election official. I think there's so much opportunity to work with
Mhm.
and learn from, but also help advise
Right.
election officials. And I think they're getting less and less scared of transparency and working with academia. And I think now is a good time to strike while the iron is hot. So
Uh,
I'll just leave it at that. And if you ever need help getting a hold of a local election official, or an e-intro or something like that, more than likely either I know them first degree or second degree of Kevin Bacon and can connect you. So yeah, just let me know. Mike can let me know.
that's great. And again, another shout out from my perspective to Lana, because I think she's been just so influential in this area. Uh,
Yeah,
Part of the reason why a
amazingly.
lot of election officials are willing to work with people like me,
Right.
because of the work that Lana has done, uh,
That's
and built a lot of, credibility in the area, and just made a lot of election officials confident about working.
it
So
helps when your former graduate student goes on to run elections.
exactly, that helps. But, it's wonderful to have had you here, and we'll have to do it again, because there's a whole bunch of other things I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah, I'd love to, and to take questions, if you allow that from the participants and stuff like that. So just ask me back anytime. I'm happy to come back. And next time you are in Santa Fe, you need to let me know, because
Will
we
do.
tend.
Lunch will be on me, because I owe you.
Oh, no, you don't, but that would be great.
Thank you so much for your time. Take care, and
Thanks.
thanks for those of you who joined us today.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks, Mike. Talk to you soon. Bye.